Hi, this is Nancy L.T. Hamilton and welcome to my studio. Today we're going to cover, the most fabulous subject, soldering. Seems to be the biggest bugaboo everybody encounters when they're working, becoming jeweler. And so there's a zillion things to discuss, so I'm briefly going to cover some of the issues involved in soldering today. Okay? So I have at this point 3 web pages on solder, about soldering, and I'm working on one called Soldering 101, which will be much more detailed. So, and I've already done a video on solder, so I'm going to be real brief on solder here, but there's a couple things that I hadn't discussed in the prior video that I'd like to cover now. So there's 5 basic types of solder. There's IT, which means intense temperature. There's hard, hard, medium, easy, and extra easy. The IT has the most silver in it and the least amount of zinc, so it melts at a much higher temperature, whereas the extra easy has more zinc, I think it's 45%, and melts at a much lower temperature. Now, that you'd think, well, then why don't we use extra easy all the time? We don't have to worry about melting our metal. Well, the problem with it is it's got a real yellow cast to it because of the amount of zinc in it. And the other issue is since it isn't a lot of silver, it's a relatively weak joint. So you want to use the highest temperature solder feasible. The reason that you use all these different types of solder are to help you to prevent the prior solder joints from melting. So generally, I'll start with, IT, by the way, is used mostly in enameling. So unless you're going to be enameling the piece, stick with hard. It melts at very high temperature. Unless you're really good, you can melt your metal, especially silver or sterling silver. So the hard solder, I would start, maybe do a couple joins. You want to do anything that has a lot of pressure or forget it, you know how my brain is, I can't remember that word. But if a joint is going to get a lot of movement or something like a ring seam here, I would do with hard solder. Certain hinges would be using hard solder. So you usually start with hard solder, not hard cider, and then move on to medium, a couple steps in medium and a couple steps in easy. I most of the time don't even use easy, and I hardly ever use extra easy. Extra easy I use only for repairs, or if I'm worried about if I'm doing a repair with a stone in place. I hate repairs, so I don't do it very often. But generally, hard, medium, and easy are the 3 that you're going to be working with. So I'm going to backtrack a little bit. I wanted to mention that there's a difference between when someone says the solder is melt temperature or the solder flow temperature. I can't remember exactly. It could 25 to 100 degree difference, I believe. Melt temperature is when your solder goes from a pallion or whatever you had there into a blob. Flow temperature is when the solder actually moves and runs, as we call it. So that's a good thing to know, because the melt temperature is not going to do you much good. The flow is what's going to do the join. Also, I wanted to mention that, in case you didn't know this, that when silver soldering, hard soldering, or brazing, whatever you want to call it, the solder joins the 2 pieces of metal together through a capillary action. Think like a paper towel that gets wet on the bottom, how the water runs up the paper towel. That's how the solder, it flows into the metal. Whereas if you're using soft soldering, something that you use a soldering iron with, what you end up, think of it as like tape, where you're coating the outside of the metal with the solder. So you can see just by the difference in how they work that you're going to have a much stronger joint with something that's joined molecularly than something that is just kind of taped together. So if you're going to make jewelry, I highly recommend that you use the hard soldering technique and leave the soft soldering for circuit boards. So another thing to know about solder before I move on is the zinc melts at a higher temperature, it kind of vaporizes. So if you overheat your piece, you may sometimes notice that you've got little pits in your solder, and what you've actually done is burn the zinc out. It also changes the melting, flowing both temperatures of the solder itself. So if you've taken all the zinc out and you're trying to figure out why that solder won't flow again, it's because you're now trying to melt silver against silver, and you can end up melting your metal. Sometimes it's better to just take it off and start again. Of course, it's really hard to get apart. So you want to keep your temperatures from getting too hot, because you don't want pitting and you don't want zinc loss on that. Although I have found that if I do a piece that has a lot of solder joins on it, that original hard solder join, because of I think because of the continued heating, is terrible to try to pull apart. I mean, I've spent hours trying to get something separated, so it almost seems like each join that you do gets a little harder than the actual melt flow temperature of the solder, if that makes any sense whatsoever. So I always start everything with so, it seems. You all know that drives me nuts. I keep doing it though. There are 4 elements, if met, you will be successful at soldering. And they're very important, and they each have their own little requirements, and it works with every metal except platinum. Maybe I think you use a different kind of flux. I've never worked with it, so I have absolutely no experience. So come down here. Here are the things that we need to talk about, and I'm going to talk about these in depth further on in the video, but right now I'm just going to run through them. A good fit means that the metal fits together tightly, because remember of the capillary action. The solder needs to flow between 2 pieces, and if they're not connected, it's not going to flow. So that's simple. Metal needs to sit on top of each other tightly. Next thing is clean metal, clean solder, clean flux, and clean hands. Most people do know about the cleaning metal, but they forget that solder gets tarnished, and tarnish is dirt. Your flux can get polluted by you sticking your paintbrush in it over and over again and pulling things off of the soldering area and dropping them into your flux bottles. So we'll talk about that. And hands. Your hands need to be really clean with no oil on them. Don't touch your face, because you have a lot of oil glands there. And anytime you do any finishing, sawing, sanding, anything like that, wash your hands before you go back to touching your metal. Try to hold it by the edges. So, because solder and flux are not going to stick to metal that has dirt, and it's like, my analogy is a mountain is your dirt, and your stuff's going to flow around the dirt. You're not going to get a nice, clean, level joint. Heat is really important. You need, the one deal with solder is it follows the heat. Wherever the torch is or the heat is, that solder is going to chase after that heat. You can almost draw with solder by pulling it around with your torch. The other thing about heat is you need to have adequate amount for the size of the piece you're working with. You don't want to have like a double-aught torch tip to solder 2 pieces together. Drop it on the floor again. Like this. You'll never get it soldered. It just won't get hot enough. So you need to have adequate torch tips. And also, solder doesn't flow. You don't heat the solder with your torch. You heat, the metal has to reach solder flow temperature for the solder to flow. So aiming that torch on the solder, all it's going to do is melt the solder. It's not going to heat the metal up. The solder's going to do weird stuff, maybe go off to one side, ball up, a bunch of weird things, and it's not going to do what you want it to do. Next thing is flux, and I'm going to just ramble on about flux, what it does, and how it helps to prevent oxidation. So those are the 4 basic things that we're going to cover in the rest of this video today. Okay. Now we're going to talk about fit a little more in depth. You want to get the smallest gap possible when you're working on your fit. And you need to take the time to do this, because you're going to spend 10 times as much time or less, maybe a little less, cleaning it up because it didn't work. So take your time, get the fit proper, and see my video on getting straight edges, or whatever the heck it's called. We'll have a link there. And if you don't know how to do it, watch the video. So this ring, which we will have a little close-up, has a really nice fit. It's really tight. And the solder is going to flow beautifully between here because these two sides are really tight. When you're doing something like this little bezel wire that I'm working on here, you want to square these edges up using, you know, your miter cutting jig or one of the other methods that I discuss in the video. And I'm not going to talk about how to solder this or hold it together. I'll wait and do a bezel making video on that. But essentially, these things need to be tight, and they need to stay together when you're soldering them. This piece is not ready to be soldered yet, but when it does, I want it to have tension. So I would do this is the same with a ring band, where you're kind of work hardening it a little bit so that it has a little spring in it. Now, of course, when you solder this, I'm not going to mess with it. When you solder this, it's going to loosen up the metal again because it'll hit the annealing temp and loosen up. So hopefully you can get this soldered before it pops open. But we'll talk about that in another video. So this piece here I did because I wanted to show what happens if there is a gap. And in this case, we will have a little close-up. The solder, there's a gap between the bottom and the top plate, and the solder ran on this side because this is a smaller piece that heated up first. So you got to make sure you don't do this because this does nothing except make you have to clean this mess up. So definitely get your fit right. This is a well-fitted piece here. When you do sweat soldering, which this is, which I will cover sometime soon, you want to see a silver edge all the way around this, and these are really easy to fit as long as both pieces are flat. You should be good to go on that. Let's see, on wire, round wire, and tubing, you don't want to just solder two round edges together because what happens is you don't have enough of a surface contact and your joint's going to be weak. It also makes it easier to hold, for the pieces to stay together. So what you should do is file a flat edge, and once again we're going to have a little close-up. File a flat edge on both pieces. If you're doing, like if you're putting two round pieces together, you file both sides that are going to touch flat. So that's basically it. Did I show you my picture? You gotta look at my picture. I spent all this time drawing this. So this is basically just a little image of good fit versus bad fit. By the way, the solder is in there molecularly. It's not on the surface. Pretend. And with the bad fit, you're going to get solder going from either one side or the other, but it's not going to jump that gap. And so that's it on fit. It's sometimes the most frustrating thing to do, like getting this little tiny thin bezel to stay together and getting the edges perfect so you when you hold it up you don't see light through it. Can take a lot of time, and it doesn't come easy to me. I still can spend a lot of time on it, but it's well worth it to put that solder on and have a beautiful flash of silver running down it and have it no cleanup. So that's what we're working for. Okay, so on to the next subject.